Congratulations on a decade. A decade!
G'day everyone and welcome to the Trekzone Spotlight. Today's guest is so far Australia's only astronaut. His name is Dr. Andy Thomas and he's joining me from the World Science Fair happening for the first time outside of New York in Brisbane. Dr. Thomas, thanks for your time. What inspired you to be an astronaut?
Well, when I was growing up, it was the early days of the space program. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the flights of Alan Shepard and John Glenn. And of course, I remember the moon landings very clearly. I was a student at university. And I looked at those and thought, what a great adventure. Wouldn't it be amazing to be involved in that? But for a kid growing up in Adelaide, that wasn't a very realistic prospect. But later in life, after I'd got an engineering degree and a PhD, I realized I could actually make that dream come true. And I then focused my career to getting the kind of credentials that I thought would be needed to become an astronaut, and I was successful in applying.
Well, you managed to achieve that with a Bachelor of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering with first-class honours from the University of Adelaide. And then you moved to the US and worked with Lockheed Martin throughout the 80s. In '92, you were selected by NASA and spent 12 months training to join the astronaut corps. What did that involve?
Yeah, I should say I also got a PhD at the University of Adelaide, and I think that was actually a pivotal education step that I needed in order to apply to the astronaut program. My first flight was, as you said, in 1996, and that was a 10-day mission on the Shuttle Endeavour. And that was preceded by a year of pretty intensive training on the specific systems that we were going to fly on that mission, as well as on all the systems that make the shuttle operate, because we had to operate the vehicle safely. And that's the kind of thing you typically do when you're training for a specific flight.
Before you flew in space, you worked as an astronaut support person. What does that role involve?
Oh, that was actually an assignment I had. While you were waiting for a flight or between flight assignments, NASA give you a job to support the overall flight program. And the first one I had after I finished my astronaut candidacy training was what they call an astronaut support person, which is the role you have to go down to the Cape and act as a liaison between what the people are doing to process the launch vehicles at the Cape and the astronaut office, which is back in Houston. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth to Cape Canaveral and working with the launch directors. And then ultimately I had the role on one flight, STS-59, I remember it, to actually assist the crew strapping in on day of launch and closing the hatch on them and sending them on their way.
That must have been a surreal experience to strap in those astronauts and send them off to space.
It was. And one of the things you get to do is you go out to the launch pad about 5 hours before the actual launch. And of course, there's no one there because of the dangers, and it's very quiet. And you have the whole shuttle to yourself. You're just sitting in the shuttle by yourself, listening to the communication loops, and it's usually the middle of the night. And that was a very surreal moment, and it made me realize just what an exciting adventure I was involved in.
Well, you served as mission specialist on flights STS-77, 102 and 114, logging more spaceflight hours than any other Australian. How does it feel to be Australia's pioneer of space?
A little humbled. I have to admit that I'm guilty of the sin of pride that I did become the first Australian citizen to fly in space. I've had, as you remarked, 4 flights, and that's 4 more than I ever expected to get, and they've been amazing flights, and I look back on it with great fondness, but also to this day a certain element of disbelief that I actually got to do that.
One of those missions involved 141 days aboard Mir. What's it like living on a space station?
You know, the flight on Mir was perhaps the most important in my career. And it was one of the highlights, if not the highlight of my spaceflight career, because I preceded that by spending a year in Russia training to become a cosmonaut. And when I was growing up in Adelaide, I might have dreamed of being an astronaut, but I never in my wildest dreams thought I could become a cosmonaut. But I got to do that, had to learn Russian, and then I went on board the Mir space station with 2 cosmonauts who didn't speak English, and spent 20 weeks there, and it was an extraordinary experience. It was one of the great experiences of my life, being weightless for 20 weeks and enjoying orbiting the Earth 16 times a day for 20 weeks.
What are the differences between a cosmonaut and an astronaut?
There's really not many. The only distinction is that a cosmonaut learns to operate a Russian spacecraft, an astronaut learns to operate a NASA spacecraft.
Having spent time on Mir and flying 2 missions to build the International Space Station, how does it make you feel to watch fellow astronauts like Commander Scott Kelly spend a full year in space?
I respect him for that. A year would be a tough flight, but I could have done it. Time flows very quickly when you're in space. It becomes a very tranquil experience, actually, when you're up there. I watch the people that are flying today, and I have to admit to a certain amount of envy that they're getting to fly. Even though I've had some great flight experiences, sometimes I feel a pang of jealousy that they're flying, and it'd be nice to fly again, but I have no complaints.
Are there any plans for you to return to flight?
Not for me, no. I retired from the agency 2 years ago, and I've hung up the flight suit and I'm leaving it for a younger generation.
Well, speaking of that younger generation, what do you think is next for human space exploration?
I think what we're going to see is we'll continue to fly the space station for about another 10 years, and we'll use that to test out the basic systems we need to go beyond low Earth orbit. I think then you'll see a return to lunar space, not necessarily to the lunar surface, but to lunar orbit perhaps, where we'll deploy a deep space habitat that will let us evaluate how those habitats operate and what is required to support them for long periods of time in space. And that'll give us the basic engineering we need in order to fly missions to Mars, because sending humans to Mars is the holy grail of human space exploration, to which all the agencies really aspire.
Well, short of our own space agency, how does an Australian become an astronaut?
Right now, there is not a career path for an Australian to fly in space because Australia does not have a relationship with NASA to fly astronauts. I think that's something that could change in time, and I would encourage all the young people here to promote that idea with their political leaders so that one day Australia could become part of the international spacefaring community.
Fantastic, Dr. Thomas. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, thank you.
It was absolutely amazing to speak to Dr. Thomas, both on camera and off as well. I've got to say a huge thanks to the World Science Festival for organising that for me, and the Queensland Museum for giving me the time as well. Well, that's it for this edition of the Trekzone Spotlight. Get in touch with me on all of these social media channels, and let's have a chat about Australians in space. It's got to be a possibility sometime in the near future. Thanks for watching. I'm Matt Miller. We'll see you again soon.